Welcome back. This is week 4, lecture 1. Um, and this week we begin to look at not just Luther, but the spread of Luther's movement, let's say. And I mean by that not necessarily a movement that Luther was trying to establish, but simply the effects and the expansion of those effects that began with what Luther was doing, but then soon, very quickly, went beyond Luther. Now, last lecture, I focused on Luther and his so-called Reformation discovery or Reformation breakthrough or Tower experience. They all refer traditionally to the same thing, that point where Luther becomes the reformer. That point where Luther then is no longer a follower of the Pope or the papacy, is no longer a quote-unquote medieval theologian or even a late medieval theologian, but something new. And this is almost like a swinging door aspect, whereby the point, if we can identify that point, then we can distinguish between the medieval Luther and the modern Luther, at least the Protestant Luther, the evangelical Luther. That's even Martin Brecht's point, this great Luther scholar, and he is a great, or was a great Luther scholar. There are points along the way where we see developments, but he had not been completely evangelical by that point. It's only a point for Brecht when Luther became thoroughly or completely evangelical that then is identified with that swinging door, which is identified then with his Reformation discovery. So the whole approach to identifying that point, that event, whatever it might have consisted of, has been based more on theological arguments and determinations than historical ones. And what I have tried to do in my Luther book, but then also as I presented to you in the previous lecture, is to say that historically seen, when we look at the evidence, the documents, we need to make a distinction between Luther's own discovery of what he refers to as passive righteousness, not as such justification by faith, even though Luther probably would not say, wait a minute, I didn't discover justification by faith, I discovered passive righteousness. He probably would equate those two because he's trying to come to an interpretation of Romans 1:17 and 18 with the just man shall live by faith. The point is that was a discovery, and a very significant discovery for Luther. It was not new, as I tried then to argue, that same position was there in the late medieval Augustinian tradition, at least within the 14th century Augustinian theologians who argued the same thing, basically. And then Luther even said himself that it was there in Augustine, and that's kind of this strong Augustinian perspective of this passive righteousness, that it's not an issue of what we as individuals do, but it's an issue of what God does to us. But that, I then argue, cannot be equated with his becoming the reformer or his break from Rome. That only occurred in 1520, I argue, in February of 1520, with his twofold discovery of, one, that he was a Hussite, even though he'd always denied that, but all of a sudden he reads Huss and like, oh my God, I'm a Hussite. But so was Paul and Augustine and everybody else. And then number two, the donation of Constantine was a fourth. They also said that should not have been all that big of a deal, but for Luther it was. And you can go into more context if you my book. I discuss his ecclesiology and try to address or deal with the question of why did Luther think that when really no one at the time did. But in that context, and then we have the 95 Theses, it becomes a real problem to determine, and even to the point where, I quote this in my book, Heiko Obermann, my teacher, I argue a lot against in my book, but I have the highest regard for it. But who argued that the attempt to try to pinpoint his Reformation breakthrough, he says, it almost has become synonymous with unscholarly, bad Luther scholarship. And I go on to say, well, that may be the case with me too, but I can do it, and here's what it is. And I argued that he had this theological discovery in December of 1514, actually, as he was lecturing on Aristotle. Um, and that was distinct from his break from Rome, which is in 1520. And then the indulgences, the theses against indulgences in 1517 is right snap dab in the middle between those two. Anyway, that was last lecture. This lecture, we then turn to look at then what? What happened with Luther's development from late medieval observant Augustinian to being someone who is attacking Rome and arguing fiercely that the papacy needs to be overthrown because it's the very throne of Antichrist, which we see in his address to the Christian nobility. His kind of call for mobilization of the German nobility against Rome. And what happens? And even though it's still not until 1524 that Luther himself takes off his monastic habit and then is married in 1525. But within that context, by that time, things had already, in some ways, gotten out of hand. The movement that Luther had unleashed resonated throughout society, at least within the empire at first, and had implications for the developments thereafter. So what we need to do is look at how did that come about? Was it just Luther? Luther even says, it was our theology. It's our Wittenberg theology, he later says, and even in 1516, even before Philip Melanchthon comes on board, so to speak, and I'll be talking about Philip Melanchthon a bit more shortly. But even before Melanchthon joins the group, Luther's already talking about our theology at Wittenberg. This theology of Augustine is winning the day, and students are flocking to lectures on Augustine and not to Aristotle. He also then really didn't consider what was going on in Wittenberg or in the empire, and this is even later. I don't remember the exact date when we have this reference, and I'm not even sure off the top of my head if this is from a tabletop or if it's from a letter somewhere. Where he says, I didn't do anything. This is not my work, what is going on in the empire with the Reformation and everything. This is, the work of the Holy Spirit. He said, and the gospel. It's the gospel and the Holy Spirit, and try to distinguish between those two. That's a whole other issue. He said, while Philip Melanchthon, and I sat around and drank good Wittenberg beer, the Holy Spirit did its work. That was Luther's perspective. And yet, as historians, we can't say, oh, and that's what was going on. And so we can't look at the development of the evangelical movement, and I'll be talking more about that in a second too, by proclaiming that, well, this was the work of the Holy Spirit. That's a theological position. And theologically, you can say that. Historically, we can't. So we need to go back and look at the historical development, how things came about. So we're going to start a little bit earlier than where we left off with the last lecture. We're going to go back to just around that 1520 part and start with a figure, in my reading and interpretation of it all, had immense significance for the development, because otherwise Luther would have been handed over to Rome. That would have been that. Namely, Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise. Go to the first slide, or the second slide, after the first slide. It is actually, Frederick the Wise, the father of the Reformation. In some ways, more than Luther. We can attribute what transpired to the actions of Frederick. Now, who was Frederick the Wise? Frederick the Wise was the Elector of Saxony. And there I have the first little entry there, Luther's Prince Frederick, the Elector of Saxony. I may have already addressed this in an earlier lecture. I don't remember. I believe I did in one of the first couple lectures, because there was a split in the later 15th century between ducal Saxony and electoral Saxony. The Duke of Saxony had been one of the electors, named in the Golden Bull of 1356 by Charles IV, Emperor Charles IV, establishing the 7 electors, and the Duke of Saxony was one of those. But then when the Duke died, and I don't remember the Duke's name, which one? He had 2 sons, Ernest and Albert, and they compromised over their inheritance, and Albert received part of what had been the Duchy of Saxony. He really received like approximately half of it, and the title Duke. And then his brother Ernest received the other approximately half of what had been the Duchy of Saxony, um, and was given the title Elector, so that the Duke of Saxony now, or Albert, or the Duke of Albertine, what was called Albertine Saxony, could not elect the emperor anymore. The elector could not be called Duke. That's why he was given the title Elector, Frederick the Wise. Now, Frederick the Wise, as Elector of Saxony, was in many ways a typical late medieval German prince. He took his responsibilities very seriously. He was a pious man, a devout man. He had one of the largest relic collections in Europe, which he was very proud of. And he had founded and established the University of Wittenberg. We have to keep all of this in mind, too, which I said before, in terms of the mentality of princes in the medieval and late medieval, still in the 16th century. The mentality of a prince was, I'm not going to say God's appointed ruler, but I am God's appointed ruler. I mean, it's different from the emperor, but still, the powers that be, I'm part of that divinely ordained order. I am responsible for my subjects, both physically and spiritually. I need to take that seriously. And I think I mentioned this in terms of the observant movement, and when we have princes establishing the observance, saying, I'm going to provide the best for my people and the best monastic experiences when we have observance. I'm going to introduce the Reformation in my territories, in the sense of the Reformation of the cloisters. And Frederick had that concept. Now, I'm not saying that every prince certainly did. We can look at, it's precept and practice, that wonderful distinction sometimes between the theory or the ideal and the actual reality. We can't say today that, are there politicians who have the best interest of their constituents at heart and are really trying to do what they think is right, and not just for their own reelection, but for the country. And I want to believe, or I feel I still have to believe, still, even in our situation today, there are some of those types of politicians still left. They take their responsibility seriously and are not simply taking one position or another because of what it will do for them or get for them. I'm not going to go into examples there. I mean, I can, think of them yourselves. But I think also, and this is a personal statement, kind of believe or feel or sense that the majority of politicians today are interested in one thing: winning. And it's almost like they don't even care about the policy. They'll take whatever policy and support whatever policy they think will do the best for them, which is not for their constituents. It's not for the country. It is simply what is the best approach to keep me in office. Now, you could say I'm being too cynical. That's fine. But my point here is not to talk about the integrity and values and visions of American politicians in 2023, but rather to say that just as not every politician has that ideal, so in late medieval on into the 16th century, not every German prince or not every prince within Christendom at the time had that ideal and took their responsibility seriously. But some certainly did. And there's everything from, isn't it great to be, Duke? I'm going to fleece the peasants all I can, and I'm going to just enjoy being Duke, and I don't care about them. Or if I'm even bishop, have a bishopric and saying I'm going to enjoy the lifestyle that I can have as bishop, and I don't care about anything else. There were those. But there were also those who took their position seriously and their responsibility seriously. Frederick was one. That was part of the reason he founded the University of Wittenberg, part of the reason he had his collection of relics, because does it attribute to his power? Of course it does. Is it good for him? Yes. We tend to today to make this dichotomy between something, if someone does something that benefits them, that can't be a genuine motivation. that it's more than that. Whereas here, it's one and the same. What benefits me, if it's good for everybody, is not contradictory. But that gets into other issues. But one of the important things is that, again, in medieval Europe on through early modern Europe, aspects that we today see as almost contradictory and canceling each other out, they held very much together. They didn't see an opposition at all as one and the same, just different kind of sides of the same coin that they were looking at. So I can take my responsibility seriously, and if it benefited me, of course it benefits me. Anyway, that's just trying to portray a little bit of what we can discern, at least what try to discern to the extent that we can, which is very small, about Frederick's mentality. He's serious, he's earnest, as was the Emperor Charles V. Now, here we have Luther becoming a celebrity for all practical purposes, beginning with his 95 Theses. Not because he was trying to become that, as I tried to say, that he was posting theses for an academic debate, but they're translated, printed, and spread. And almost overnight, he becomes a sensation. Frederick is like, great, this benefits me. People are now talking about the University of Wittenberg, which they hadn't for a while. But now this is a public event. It needs to be seen as such. And what do we do about it? And also maybe Luther has a point. Now, as I've also argued before in previous lectures, the critique against indulgences was no new thing. People have been criticizing indulgences for at least a century. And there's two parts to this. One is critiquing the theory of indulgences. The other is critiquing the practice of indulgences and how indulgences were being announced or preached or marketed, therefore sold. And it was that kind of marketing selling point that received the primary criticism. And that's what fueled Luther's reaction too, both as a pastor of his parish at the University of Wittenberg Castle Church for his parishioners, but then also as a theologian. He said, there's kind of also some problems with the theory of indulgences. Even though still in 1517, he's like, okay, I'm not trying to get rid of the theory of indulgences as such, but the practice and the understanding thereof. And he says this is a theological issue that we need to debate in the universities as theologians. That then quickly transformed from being strictly a theological and pastoral issue to being a social and cultural and political issue. Because when we have the indulgence that was being preached at this time was the indulgence coming from Rome that was to fund the new building or the building of the new St. Peter's. And it was seen as almost a tax being imposed upon the believers in the empire by the Italians. There's a lot of animosity, cultural animosity. And that ties in with Luther's critique. So there begins to be a fair amount of support for Luther from early on. Not all of his support just kept on following him. He had Erasmus supported him at first in terms of his critique against indulgences and things. Other humanist reformers and imperial knights supported him. Some followed and continued with him. Others said, I'm not going to go that far. So, kind of the story. Luther finally is threatened with excommunication in December. He burns the letter coming from the Pope threatening excommunication. Exsurge, don't rise up, O Lord. There's a wild boar in your vineyard. You have to get rid of it. That's Luther is the wild boar that had to be gotten rid of. He burns it. There's opposition. There's resistance. And then in January of 1520, since Luther had not recanted, he is officially excommunicated. He was to be captured sent to Rome for trial for heresy, and his writings would be confiscated and burned. That's what we do. But who was going to do that? It's one thing to make the proclamation, it's another thing to execute it. And Frederick said, I'm not so sure we're going to do this. I'm not so sure. And because, number one, there is an issue of this Roman interference, these Italians. We should deal with this in Germany. We could footnote, there is no such thing as Germany, but at this point, but the empire, within the empire, within the Germanic speaking, there is a concept of the Germans, the German nation as the Germanic speaking peoples. And so he says we should really deal with this within the empire and not allow Rome to dictate what we're doing. Now, so Frederick and some of the other German princes and some of the cities who were following Luther by this time convinced the new emperor, Charles V, who had just been elected in 1519, not to hand over Luther immediately, but let's deal with this on German soil. And they said, we have the Imperial Reichstag coming up in this spring, early summer. Let's deal with Luther there. And this is going to be meeting at the city of Worms. Let's deal with it at Worms. Okay. Charles finally was persuaded to be okay. So we have then Charles inviting Luther to come to Worms to discuss the situation. Now, Luther had recently read Huss. He knew what had happened to Huss. He knew that Huss had received a safe conduct in the Emperor Sigismund, and what happened to Huss? He was burned at the stake in Constance. Luther feared that was happen to him. He felt it in his bones that he was not going to come back from Worms, regardless of the outcome. Well, he pretty much knew what the outcome was going to be. He didn't think he could convince the emperor, but he does go to Worms under safe conduct, and makes his famous statement. This is where I may have already gone through this one. I'm going to go through it again. But also, legend seeps into history, because what happened was that Luther arrived at Worms. He was brought before the Reichstag, the Imperial Legislature, at the Diet, which is the meeting of Worms, meeting of the Reichstag. And all of his writings have been published by that time, were placed before him. And he was asked if he was the author of these works. And he looked at me and said, well, it looks like it, yeah. It looks like these are all my works. And then he was asked, do you recant these works? And Luther said, what? Well, do I have to do it all at once, or can I go through them? Because I probably made some mistakes. I probably didn't always formulate everything as carefully or correctly as I could have. If I could go through them line by line, can go through and tell you what I might be willing to recant, what I'm not. But okay. So no, it has to be all or nothing. So, well, I'm gonna have to think about this. Goes to bed, comes back the next day. Said, well, Martin, are you going to recant now? He says, well, you know what? Since I cannot go through it line by line, it's an all or nothing thing. Unless I can be convinced from Scripture that I am wrong, it would be a sin to go against my conscience. Therefore, I cannot and will not recant. God help me. Amen. Now, later in the accounts of his stance at Worms, an additional phrase was added. that what Luther said was, I cannot and will not, can't. Here I stand, God help me. That here I stand was a later addition. It was not anything that Luther said. And his whole appeal to conscience, I think I may have already addressed this to an extent, was nothing new. And people made so much, even good scholars have made so much of this in the past, in the more popular presentations it's made out to be a huge significance. I don't remember off the top of my head what your textbook says about it, but it's not an appeal to conscience and individuality in a new sense of Renaissance, and God forbid of humanism, because humanism this time has nothing to do with that, which is another pet peeve of mine, that people read back definitions and meanings and understandings. It was an accepted traditional medieval position, because your conscience was that spark in you from the synteresis that told you right from wrong. It was that feeling in your gut. And it was almost, I can't even put it in these terms, it was a remnant from before the fall. In the fall of Adam and Eve, going all the way back. Humans fell. All of nature and all creation fell. We were corrupt. But there was still remained the synteresis that was not affected. That was that inner feeling of, you do know what's right. It is that feeling that Eve, and that was why Eve's, and then Adam's too, because he went along with it, their sin was so consequential for all of humanity thereafter, because they knew better. God had said, "Do not eat from this, tree of the good wisdom of knowledge of right and wrong. Every other tree you can eat from." And then the devil sows doubt, and this was a big deal for Luther. And I have argued too that for Luther, original sin primarily became not as it was for Augustine and all through the medieval tradition, associated with concupiscence or lust or being turned in upon oneself. But original sin for Luther was fear and doubt. Fear and doubt. Doubt and fear. Because when you start doubting, you fear. And what you doubt is, maybe it wasn't. That was what, the serpent told Eve. Caused her to doubt. Even that gnawing feeling in her stomach, well, maybe, yeah, I know it's not right, but that's the synteresis. And the medieval position was, if you knowingly act against your synteresis, against that conscience, that knowing of right and wrong, if you follow what you know is wrong, you sin doubly. When you can follow what you think is right, and you could be wrong. Your synteresis is supposed to tell you, but if you really believe what you're doing is right, it can still be wrong. But if you believe or sense or feel that what you're doing is wrong, and you do it anyway, that's a double sin, so to speak. So Luther's saying, I cannot be a sin to go against my conscience. That is all of the traditional medieval position that was taken and taught. Footnote, Luther later kind of got rid of the whole concept of the synteresis, but that's a whole other development. I mean, not of the conscience, certainly. That was his stand. And for Charles, this 19-year-old kid, I mean, obviously a 19-year-old, 15, 21, no, he's 20, 21 by this time, 21, 15, 21, 15, 20, 21, 20, is far, the whole maturation process is different. I think Charles was king of Spain when he was 16, Holy Roman Emperor, elected when he was 19, and now he's having to make this determination, but still there's an element that he's still a kid, so to speak, even though far more mature than at least my 19-year-old. That's a whole other. He said, Martin, How can you alone be right? In 1,000 years of church tradition you fall. Therefore, you are condemned. Your writings are to be confiscated and burned. You are to be sent to Rome to stand trial for heresy. The edict that came out of the Diet of Worms, the Edict of Worms, was the edict condemning Luther. This was going to have major importance. The Edict of Worms, which was proclaimed at the Diet of Worms in 1521. And the edict, E-D-I-C-T, just to make sure that you get it back correctly, the Edict of Worms condemned Luther. This was to be the point of contention from this point on. But we'll be coming back to that. But Charles, in some ways, had a little bit more integrity than Sigismund, because Charles, at least apparently, was going to uphold his safe conduct, in that Luther was not immediately arrested and then burnt at the stake. He was allowed to leave Worms. He knew he was going to be captured, because once he leaves Worms, then he's under the ban. He's walking to go back to Wittenberg, and he hears horses coming up behind him, and doesn't really, he hears and looks, but before he even knows what's going on, a sack had been placed over his head. He had been picked up and was whisked away. He assumed whisked away to be handed over to Rome. Didn't even take that long after he got out of the Diet. But when the horses finally stopped, he was let off. He wasn't in Rome. He wasn't anywhere other than a castle. It was the castle actually called the Wartburg, which was a castle of Frederick the Wise. Frederick the Wise had arranged for Luther to be hidden and saved from being prosecuted and sent to Rome. Had Frederick not done that, think of the impact that could have had if Luther had been arrested, captured, and sent to Rome, tried. By this point, in 1521, he had enough support. It would have still been of major significance, and Luther would have been seen as a martyr and all of that. But the whole trajectory of what would have transpired would have been different. Frederick preserved Luther. That is really important. And it was at the Wartburg that Luther then began to translate the Bible. I'll be coming back to that later on in this lecture. Everyone back in Wittenberg, his colleagues, were kind of freaking out a bit. They did not know what had happened. This was secret, of course. Frederick didn't say, I'm going to stop this. That would have been open contradiction to the emperor and to the whole imperial diet, the Reichstag. So he has to be, he's not denying it necessarily, but he's not flaunting it. He's just hiding Luther and protecting Luther. So Luther has to be hidden in secret. Melanchthon and Karlstadt, both of whom I'll be talking about shortly, they assumed the worst. Luther had been off to Worms. He doesn't return. We don't really know what's going on, and what do we do, and where do we go from here? So that is kind of the situation. That's why I refer to Frederick as the father of the Reformation, because he made Luther possible to continue developing, to continue to lead the movement that had begun as a result of his 95 Theses. I mean, there is good reason to point to Luther's posting of the 95 Theses as the beginning of the Reformation, without question, because that is the point the beginning point when Luther becomes a name, a cause, a movement, not just an individual. In my reading of things and interpretation of things, there's no basis whatsoever to claim that the 95 Theses represents the beginnings of Luther's Reformation as Luther for himself. He does not become the reformer 1517. He doesn't. We can say, well, maybe 1520. Okay, we're getting there. But by 1517, no, he is still an obedient, observant Augustinian hermit. When we look at the broader perspective, 1517 and the 95 Theses, yeah, that's the beginning of as a movement. Not for Luther himself. And that's a fine distinction to make, but it's all important. Now, as I said, moving now to what was going on in Wittenberg during all this time. We have two major players, Andreas Bodenstein from Karlstadt and Philip Melanchthon. And they both kind of vied for leadership of the movement, what was going on, with Luther out of the picture. They didn't know where he was. They didn't know what had happened. So we'll be addressing both. I'm going to start with Karlstadt. He was the older colleague and became more radical. Very interesting figure, Andreas Bodenstein. Or just Karlstadt. Karlstadt was actually Luther's senior colleague. He actually was the theologian on the faculty who granted Luther his doctorate in theology back in 1512. So he had a significant position at Wittenberg and standing. He was senior to Luther. He became radicalized, and I mean that in the genuine sense of radicalized. We still use that term today in a political situation, but this was a theological radicalization because in 1516, Karlstadt had a conversion, so to speak. And this is there on the slide, the second point. Luther was presiding over a disputation of one of his students, Bartholomew Feldkirchen. Number of theses, again, that was being debated. And Feldkirchen was defending the thesis that the treatise, or the book treatise, on true and false penitence that had been attributed to Augustine was actually not by Augustine. It was wrong attribution. Karlstadt stood up publicly and said, no, you're wrong, that is Augustine. Whereupon Luther, and this is all in public, keep in mind, came to his student's defense and said, no, it's not. And if you think it is, you are dead wrong and don't know Augustine, because this is not a work of Augustine's. Go read it yourself. Now, to Karlstadt's credit, I thought, okay, maybe I should. I mean, he was humiliated. Karlstadt was humiliated. But, again, to his credit, he went out and bought the Opera Omnia of Augustine. It was just being published, and first volumes were coming out in 1516. The Opera Omnia being the collected works, all the works. And in going through them, he came to the realization, oh my God, Luther was right. He was right about Augustine. And this was far more than simply this pamphlet or this one work. My whole understanding, Karlstadt came to realize, has been wrong, and Luther's is right. And everything has to change. And Karlstadt began advocating for radical change. He publishes in 1518 his own commentary on Augustine's on the Spirit and the Letter, De Spiritu et Littera. And he then tried to assert his authority in Wittenberg, both at the university, but also, keep in mind, this is also the parish of Wittenberg. And over the parish, with Luther's absence. Because Luther was the leading figure and has the authority, that charismatic authority, as well as the institutional authority as professor of theology, as was Karlstadt. With that gone, Karlstadt tries to move forward. And he comes to the position of, you know what? There's no basis in Scripture, there's no basis in Augustine, or no basis really anywhere that we can find for withholding the cup from the laity. There's nothing we can find in the patristics, really, or certainly not in Scripture, for this ecclesiastical hierarchy. Yes, priests are important, but we're all priests. And he said, we need to bring this about. We need to get rid of all the images in churches. He starts preaching against images. There begins to be the first Reformation outbreak of iconoclasm was in Wittenberg in 1521. Breaking of images, because these are graven images, and we know what the Ten Commandments say. This is wrong. And he announces to everyone, I am going to celebrate Mass on Christmas, 1521, and I'm going to give everybody both the cup and the bread. Or should the other way around, both the bread and the cup. Because the cup was the one that was different. It was known, and he did celebrate the Mass that way. When he showed up to celebrate Mass on Christmas, he was not wearing his priestly vestments. He was simply wearing a common robe. And he offers communion of both kinds to everyone. This is the first evangelical Mass that was taking place. He also arranged for the city council of Witten, the city council, not the elector, the city council, to pass a city ordinance to institute what he saw as needed for reform, including condemning images, including communion of both kinds, putting this into city law. And Luther heard about this. When he heard what was going on, he had a problem. He knew there was problems in Witten. Because after, I forget how long it took before the people in Wittenberg, Karlstadt and Melanchthon, became aware that Luther actually was being protected by Frederick in the Wartburg. They did finally learn that, and they started to be communication back and forth. We're talking about Luther's translation. Luther would be writing, asking Melanchthon's advice and Karlstadt's advice about how best to translate certain passages and things. So they knew that he was there. So he had heard about the outbreaks. And Melanchthon, too, while Luther was in the Wartburg, had a problem because at this time as well, what's been called as the Zwickau prophets came through. These were a couple of individuals who were claiming direct revelation from God concerning things such as the Eucharist and the whole kind of tenor in terms of church practice. Karlstadt was very interested in them, and Melanchthon was like, I don't know what to do. And he writes and asks, he says, Luther, how do I deal with these people? They're saying things that I'm not really sure right. And Luther said, test the spirits, which too was a medieval tradition. Luther's early 14th century confrere Henry of Freemeyer, whom I've studied, wrote a whole treatise on discerning the spirits. So Luther didn't know it. At least there's no evidence that we know that he knew it. He may have, because it was a very widespread treatise. That's the kind of thing that he could have read and would not have cited as such. But it's really kind of testing, is this a human perspective or is this really divine? So Melanchthon was kind of on the fence. We're not really going, but Karlstadt kind of went more with them. They're undermining and questioning the whole issue of transubstantiation. They're questioning the the sacramental system, the such baptism as well. What do we do with all of this? And then on top of that was this whole problem of the iconoclasm and the ecclesiastical ordinances, turning it into law. And that was just too much for Luther. So Luther returns to Wittenberg, coming almost out of hiding, so to speak, in March of 1522, and preaches a series of 8 sermons, which are known as the Invocavit sermons. Invocavit was one of the Sundays, and they're often Sundays are referred to liturgically by the passages given. Invocavit is to I invoke, I call. A series in which he's condemning what's going on. He's condemning the ecclesiastical ordinances published by the Wittenberg City Council, but no, you'll see ecclesiastical ordinances being published by the City Council in Geneva in 1541, late in the next section of this course. But he condemned those. You're going too far. We have to stop. He says, we have to think first of all for the consciences of our parishioners. Even if you're right about some of these issues, Luther would say, we have to teach the people. You can't just go whole hog and jump off the deep end, so to speak. We have to be pastoral and realize that we need to progress slowly and to teach as we go so people are going to be ready for it. This was, what was Karlstadt proposed was monumental change in terms of what had been. What do you do with the sacraments? What do you tell someone who is on their deathbed, who calls for a priest and calls for last rites, who just assumes that if I don't receive last rites, I'm going to go to hell? I don't want to go to hell. I need last rites. That was what they had grown up with. And even if they were supporters of Luther, what is it going to be like when you're on your deathbed? How do we really know that this is the right thing to do? He that eats unworthily eats to their damnation, says Paul. Don't I have to go to confession before I can receive, communion? How do I know? How do I know that the Pope actually is the Antichrist? I'm participating now in something that, kind of crowd mentality, right? But then the conscience starts kicking in, and it's a sin to go against one's conscience. You need to be aware of that. And Luther was aware of that for his parishioners. So he almost publicly humiliates Karlstadt once again. Because with Luther's return, with his authority, Karlstadt's innovations then were overturned, going back to a quote-unquote more normal approach. And Karlstadt had had enough, and he fled. He left Wittenberg, and he went on, became a pastor in the little city of Orlamünde. He became one of the kind of founders of what has been called the Radical Reformation, which I'll talk a little bit about later on in the course as well. Very fascinating figure. He's been seen as also one of the founding fathers of the Baptist tradition, which I'll get into a little bit, I think. I think I have a lecture on the Radical Reformation. I may not have because of just the shortened of the summer, but certainly in Lindbergh we'll talk about the Radical Reformation and things. So that was kind of still coming out of Wittenberg. Melanchthon is there. Melanchthon certainly remains because Melanchthon looked up to Luther. Melanchthon is junior to Luther, and he is very glad that Luther is back so they can continue working together. So the question then becomes, with Karlstadt then over and done with, so to speak, at least in terms of Wittenberg, and at least in terms of his direct participation in Wittenberg, even though he's a thorn in Luther's side thereafter too. Who is Melanchthon? And I think I said earlier in 1516, at the beginning of this lecture, when Luther was hailing the triumph of Augustine's theology and everything, Melanchthon wasn't there yet. So who was Melanchthon? When did he come there? And how did that all work? Melanchthon was Wittenberg's professor of Greek. I have their humanist and Wittenberg's professor of Greek. And the humanism of Wittenberg. I'm going to try to abbreviate. I probably, once I get through with this, we'll probably take a break. This will be week 4, lecture 1, part 1. And then we'll go back to lecture week 4, lecture 1, part 2, before coming to week 1, lecture 2, part 1. Or I'm not sure if it will be in 2 parts or not, but I wasn't sure about this lecture either. But looking at it, I thought, yeah, it's probably going to be in 2 parts. And I think we'll be looking at how it's going now, but this is really important. So I'll try to finish up with Melanchthon, and then we'll take a break. And I'll come back. Melanchthon, and he was a humanist. Now, he came to Wittenberg only in 1518. To understand all this, we need to look at humanism at Wittenberg, and humanism as such. Humanism is, as I kind of indicated earlier on, is very misunderstood. Humanism in the Renaissance, and here I'm talking both about the Italian Renaissance, but also the Renaissance north of the Alps, had nothing to do with what today has been called, or in modern times, so to speak, called secular humanism. What is that position? That position is humanist, focuses on the grandeur of being human, the capabilities of being human. We don't need anything divine because we're better. We're independent, wonderful things. We don't need God because I'm a humanist. I view the humanity being the ultimate. Now, that's probably a caricature. But not dealing with that part of humanism, but looking back at Renaissance humanism. That's certainly what Renaissance humanism was not, whether it was in Italy or north of the Alps. And the problem is that often that's how it's interpreted. It's interpreted as the beginnings of this tradition of humanism that comes to fruition in the modern time with secular humanism. We see the beginnings right there. That's not the case whatsoever. The humanists were very critical of the institutional hierarchy, as was a lot of other people. They were not critical of religion in any way, shape, or form. They were all devout Christians. At least that's what we would call them. They didn't even question it. That's the way it is. A humanist, in the most technical sense, was someone who taught the humanities. In the medieval universities, as they're developing in the 13th century and on to the 14th, 15th centuries, the curriculum was based on Aristotle. You would read Aristotle. It wasn't the only thing that you read, but you would read the text, and but the instruction overall was based on texts. So there weren't courses in topics. There were courses on given texts, and the master would read the text, comment on the text. Students would take notes. There'd be debates about it. Very much memorization. It was very much based on logic and debate and analysis. Aristotle's logical works, his earlier works, his the more advanced logical works of prior and posterior analytics and stuff. Ethics was just beginning to be lectured on. I mentioned that Luther was planning on lecturing on the ethics. He was lecturing on the physics. He really attacked Aristotle's ethics and the whole doctrine of Aristotelian ethics. He was really very much acting against that in his early comments. There was no such thing as courses or teaching of literature, history, poetry, languages. Music was one of the traditional 7 liberal arts, but even there, the music that was taught as part of the liberal arts at the universities was not how to sing or how to perform. That had nothing to do with music. Music was a mathematical discipline of proportions. Don't need to go all into there, but if you know music at all, if you know anything about it, or know at least things like the intervals and octaves, and all that. If you don't worry about it. But the intervals, like on a piano keyboard, you have an octave from C to C, then C, B, E, F, G, and the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. I'm not going to sing it for you because I probably wouldn't get it very well anymore. Um, so that's an octave, and if you get a string and pluck a string, you get a note. If you put your finger directly in the middle of that string and pluck half of it, you get an octave. You'll get the same sound, but an octave higher. And those are the intervals, are all those in between. So mathematics or music at the universities was a study of mathematical proportions. It's only then that it became more elevated, talking about things like the music of the heavenly spheres. What's the basis of the things? If we have these heavenly bodies, I should talk about the Ptolemaic system, and I don't really have time to do that here and now. And this is just before Copernicus, and we could talk about that at some point. I would love to talk about that at some point. But these spheres are rotating. Motion and would make sound. So the issue is looking at the proportion of one or the other. And we know that things that vibrate make sounds. So there must be the sounds of the heavenly spheres, which is the music of the heavenly spheres. Anyway, the whole point of this is that what we call the liberal arts and what we call the humanities, they don't really have a place in the medieval university. The humanists, that's where it kind of started, began to say, this is what is so important and that we need to teach. And so they started doing so outside the university structure in Italy. It kind of originates and rises with city secretaries and chancellors who are realizing that, you know what, if we can persuade, they're lawyers, we can say lawyers, if we can persuade the jury, we'll win. How do you persuade? Logic is not always the best strategy for persuasion to convince somebody of your position. It's very effective. You can need it, but it doesn't always work. But if you can persuade them to, and this led to the humanist dictum that it is better to do the good than to know the truth. Now, I'm getting far beyond myself, but the point here is that how many of you do or have done something that you know is wrong, or at least not in your best interest? Something that's not good for you. That's insanity. That's irrational. The idea for the humanists is if we can persuade people to do the good, it doesn't matter if they know the truth, because people don't act on the truth. But if they can act on the good, that is what we'll have better citizens that way. And if I'm a lawyer, if I can persuade the jury, I'll win. Now, who were the best practitioners of persuasion, which is rhetoric? The ancients. Cicero. Cicero was a lawyer and a statesman. So the humanists started to look back to classical models of rhetoric, that's what, and it's not just what we think of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the whole kind of teaching. I mean, Augustine, when he was a teacher there in Carthage and Rome and then Milan, he was a rhetor. That was an official position. He was the city rhetor in Milan. It was based on classical education. And so there's this return to classical ideas and therefore to classical texts that started developing. Now, if you were at the university and you were teaching in the arts faculty, based on Aristotle, you were called an artist, someone who taught the arts. If you were on the law faculty, you were called a legist, someone who taught the law. Now, if you were a theologian, you were called a theologian. You weren't called a theologist. Um, but there could be some. But the issue is, so if you taught the humanities, or in Latin at the time, the humaniora, the more humane disciplines outside the university, you were referred to as a humanist, someone who taught the humanities. Part of this interest in the classical antiquity, not just with the Latin Roman antiquity, but also with the Greek. And we see especially after the Council of Basel in 1431, where we have a delegation from Constantinople coming over, an increased emphasis and interest in Greek and the teaching of Greek, and wanting to learn Greek, not just Latin, but Greek, as part of the humanist idea. In the north of the Alps, as this humanist movement moves north of the Alps in a more traditionally Christian, I use this hesitantly, they added Hebrew to it because it's like we need to study Hebrew. That's not to imply that Italy is secular. The cultural distinctions between Italy and Northern Europe still today are huge. I'm not going to go into all that. But for a Northern European or someone from a Northern European descent, if you've never been to Italy, the first time you go, it's like, this is complete insanity. Won't go into all those differences, but those differences were already there in the 16th century. We're talking about the original Italian humanism and then Christian humanism in the north. Is not to say that Italian humanism was not Christian humanism. It was. There's not a single humanist who was not just accepted Christian. Well, there could probably be Jewish humanists who were not Christians, but that's a whole other issue in terms of this course. But I hope you know what I'm meaning. But in the North, they added Hebrew, so it was the trilingual man. And the whole issue of women in humanism is a whole other issue. And there's a whole course on the Renaissance that we need to take, or my Europe in the High and later Middle Ages. But this is just important background for understanding Melanchthon, where he's coming from, and calling him a humanist, because he definitely was a humanist. He became a professor of Greek. And so in Wittenberg, with the desire to reform, because the humanist program was just beginning to make inroads within the university. It's only like in the 1480s that I think the University of Cologne or Heidelberg, I forget which it was first, was the first university to allow someone to give lectures in poetry. And then it kind of spreads, and so it took a while before lectures and therefore scholars of the humanities were given university positions. And at first they weren't even allowed, but then they started slowly being allowed to give lectures and then become part of. And Wittenberg wanted to reform the university, and that's one very clear reference for the term Reformation. Reformation became the reformation of the university curriculum in the sources to effect a reformation of the university curriculum to include humanistic disciplines of the humaniora, literature, ethics, poetry, part of literature, and the languages. So when Wittenberg is wanting to do that, they think we need to have a professor of Greek. They tried to get Johannes Reuchlin, who was an old man, but one of the most famous Greek scholars in all of Europe. Right? And Reuchlin was grateful, but he said, I'm too old for this. But my nephew, Philip Schwarzerd, is brilliant. He's young. He's 21. He was born in 1497. 748. Anyway, and you should hire him. And so Wittenberg said, okay, we will. They hire Philip Schwarzerd, who had studied Heidelberg, and then at Tübingen as well. And he came in 1518. He was appointed as professor of Greek in 1518. So he's 21 years old. Young. 1518, Luther was 35 years old, born in 1483. I hope I got getting my math right. 17 and 18 is 35, right? Yeah. So he's 35. You have this, 21-year-old kid coming. And Melanchthon gave his inaugural address on the Reformation of Studies at Wittenberg and why it was important. And that won Luther over. Luther thought, this guy's great. We need to work together. Luther kind of took him under his arm. Melanchthon became caught up in Luther's charismatic authority and position and everything else. And they start working very closely together. So that Melanchthon was really the right-hand man. Now, I had said Philip Schwarzerd. Yeah, but this is the humanist aspect. Philip Schwarzerd said, I want to be professor of Greek at Wittenberg. And Schwarzerd is kind of a very German name. I'm going to just use a Greek version of it. Melanchthon is Greek for black earth, which is what Schwarzerd translates into. So he didn't transliterate, but he translated literally his German name Schwarzerd, black earth, into Greek, Melanchthon. So he's been known as Philip Melanchthon ever since. Now, Melanchthon started studying theology. Luther said, Philip, you're so good, you got to study theology. And he gets his bachelor's degree, which is even below the master's. You can't teach at a university with a bachelor's degree. But Melanchthon did in theology in 1521. And started also, Luther was trying to get him to offer lectures on theology, which he started doing on the Bible. Because the Bible, whatever you might think of it, is a text. And what did the humanists do? They studied texts. What did the scholastics do? Scholars at the universities, they studied text, but in a different way. Melanchthon was to have a huge impact. And we'll talk more about Melanchthon as we go along. In some ways, no, I'm not going to say that because I can't defend that position at all. I was going to say he almost had a more, was more of an importance for the development of Lutheranism than Luther was. Might be able to debate that. That could be a fun debate. But I'm not sure that could be held up depending on how we define impact or importance or influence. But Melanchthon, as we'll see, he's the one who composed and constructed the Confession of Augsburg in 1530, which I'll come back to. That I don't think today, but even in part 2, but maybe next lecture, second lecture for this week. Luther even said, I think I referenced in last week's lecture, in terms of his Opera Omnia, when he was asked to write a preference, he says, you know what? All my work should be burned except for the captivity of the slavery, the servitude of the soul, the liber or the servitude and my small canon. Everything else, Phillips is better. He's Loci Communes. Commonplaces of theology should be the standard textbook, as Peter Lombard's sentences had been since the early 13th century. Luther says Phillips' Loci Communes should be. That is a whole other issue, and it'd be fun to talk a lot about that. They went through a number of editions. I think the first edition was in 1522. 1545, I think, is the last. I could be. I have to check again when the last edition. But look when they start. Maybe 1555. As it also expands and everything else. He's works on it. His own theological understanding develops in participation. The point here being is that Luther even points to Melanchthon's Loci Communes being far more important than his works. And that's one thing for Luther to say that. It's another thing for historians to look back and say what really had the most impact, blah, 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 blah. Point is that Melanchthon and Luther start working very closely together. I have referred to Melanchthon as Luther's right-hand man. He's like Luther's lieutenant. And they cannot be really separated. And we'll see, I may reference this sometime in a later lecture. When Luther dies in 1546, Melanchthon kind of assumes the helm, but then there is a split within Lutheranism between those people following Melanchthon And then what were called the Gnesiolutherans, or the original Lutherans, following von Amsdorf and some other people who were students of Luther. But that is a separate debate for later on, which I'll maybe referencing later on, but not back here. I just want to kind of give you the perspective in terms of Melanchthon, who he was, and his significance. But in 1521, in Wittenberg, he is still a relatively new professor of Greek. He's studying theology for his bachelor's. Everyone knows that he has Luther's support. But he still, as I already said, he wasn't really sure what to do about anything and everything. And yet, he starts also in writing textbooks. He writes the textbooks on Latin. He writes a textbook of Latin grammar, Greek grammar. He writes a textbook on physics, on ethics, on a whole variety of things. And he became known as the teacher of Germany because his textbooks were used within the empire until essentially the later 18th century, and they were still used thereafter, except there was another person who also became known as the teacher of Germany in the 18th century, Christian Johannes Wolff, who did something similar, kind of updating Melanchthon stuff. We kind of began to take over. So Melanchthon's impact on the education was huge. He was very important about the education, very concerned about it, and we'll be hearing more about that in next week's lecture and probably hereafter as well. The impact of Melanchthon and the educational endeavor is why, if you think back, what did Luther say when he gets back in his Invocavit sermons? We need to teach people. We need to teach people. Not just about Christian doctrine and right belief and right practice. It also had that broader sense of we need to teach people. We'll be talking about that later too. So that was Melanchthon's importance. Now, that then provides this context for the continued development of the movement or movements that Luther unleashed in 1517. But how do you get the word out? I'm going to take a break now. And of course, since these are videotaped, you can stop these at any time and take as many breaks as you want. You can go back and listen to them over and over again if you want. But I'm going to have a break right now. Then I'll come back and I'll get this posted and then come back and do part two. Week 4, lecture 1. We're going to be looking at printing and the spread of the word and see the Reformation really as the first mass media propaganda event. But we'll get back to that after our break. Thank you so much. See you soon again.